Hi friends, welcome to Blade Broom. I'm Lorelei Black, and this week we're going to be talking about ethics in both traditional witchcraft and in Wicca. So today I want to take the opportunity to compare and contrast a little bit the ethical norms that are embraced by traditional folkloric witchcraft as opposed to Wicca. And not because I want to assert that one is superior to the other, but because I think that it's useful to look at them in that compare contrast, to sort of use the Venn diagram of the two, because so many people are familiar with what Wicca embraces that for probably 6 decades now, 7 decades, since the 1950s, that's been put forth, that's been published as this is how witches and pagans live their lives as ethical practitioners of magic. But really, if you're practicing from a traditional or a folk-based religious system, wherever you're coming from within the world, whether that's a European or an Afrodiasporic or really wherever, you may be approaching ethics from a very different place, from a very different perspective. And so I think it's useful to look at it in terms of what do we share and what do we have not in common. Not that one is better than the other, but that one may be more useful for you in your practice than the other. And so you're not going to know what's going to work for you if you don't know that more than one exists. So let's look at that. Because Wicca is the more commonly known practice, let's start by looking there first. So in the 1950s, somewhere between 1953 and 1957, Gerald Gardner, as he was writing his Book of Shadows, what is sort of known generally as the Gardnerian Book of Shadows, wrote a document that became known as the Ardanes, or the old laws. And ardain is a word that is just sort of a variation on the word ordain, which really just means a law or, a common practice, something that regulates the ethical behavior or the moral compass within a group. What's interesting about this is that there doesn't seem to be, and lots of scholars have looked into this, both inside and sort of outside of the craft, as far as people that are interested in that, that anthropological side of things. Lots of people have looked for evidence that something like this existed within the craft before Gardner wrote it, and they can't find much evidence that it did. So this document sort of popped up when Gardner needed it most. He needed a way to explain to not just the Wiccans that were being attracted to his path, people like Doreen Valiente and others who were looking to him and saying, well, what guides us? What are the rules that we should be living by? But also, people in the world around him that were starting to be attracted to this path. So he needed something. I mean, people do look to their spiritual leaders, to their religious leaders for that kind of guidance. And so he said, yeah, what do we have? So he put together this list, and it's a decently long list. You can look at it. Versions of it still exist, but it was revised in the 1980s because a lot of that original list is actually quite misogynistic. It's quite sexist in its language. It is definitely not politically correct by today's standards. And it wouldn't do, it would not serve us well today. And of course, a lot of the ethics of previous generations don't serve us well. We can't entirely look to the ethics of the past for how we should be living our lives today. We have to keep reinventing ourselves. We have to keep looking to see how we should be behaving now, and with an eye for, will I find honor in my actions in the future when I look back at my past? So, sometimes these things don't hold up well. So the Ardanes are one set of governing principles within Wicca, and another couple of sets of governing principles, and these are probably more familiar to people no matter what you're practicing within neo-paganism, are the Threefold Law and the Wiccan Rede. So the Threefold Law, of course, embraces the concept that whatever kind of energy you put out into the world is going to return to you times 3. The Wiccan Rede, of course, is probably one of the most famous. It was written by Doreen Valiente in 1964. She had worked with Gerald Gardner in and around that time, or just prior to that time. The Rede got expanded into a poem-length version, and then there are other versions of it. But the short form of the Rede, the first one that existed, are these 8 words: "And it harm none, do what you will." And it is most often interpreted as long as you are not causing harm to another, you can do what it is that you are willed to do, or what is in alignment with your will. And of course, as I say this, if you have any background in Thelema, you are going to recognize my understanding of the concept of will in there. If you are not familiar with Thelema, then you may want to familiarize yourself a little bit with the work of Aleister Crowley. I know he's a controversial figure, but his Book of the Law very much informed a lot of what Gardner was writing, and there are heavy doses of Thelema in Wicca. So love him or hate him, Crowley's influence, both the Hermetic magic that's there and also the Law of Thelema, which is stated as, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will." You can obviously see that very much echoed in what Doreen Valiente wrote. But Crowley wrote his words 60 years prior. So, we see these thoughts echoed throughout Wicca. They're just embedded within the metaphysical structure of Wiccan craft. So it's important for you to understand that part of history and how that magic influences, how the Thelemic magic influences Wiccan magic as well. So that is one part of Wiccan ethics. And there's this, and it's relatively straightforward. Now, what I will say is that a lot of folks that are practicing Wicca are not familiar with the Ardanes. They're very familiar with the Threefold Law, and they're very familiar with the Wiccan Rede, and they do their best to live within those guiding principles, and having fairly straightforward but sometimes difficult to navigate, because it can be difficult to actually not harm anybody while you're going about doing your business, whatever that business is. But having those kind of straightforward principles works for a lot of folks. I know what it is that I'm supposed to do. I struggle to do it sometimes, but it keeps me in my lane. And a lot of people like that. Within traditional witchcraft, the lines are, I'm not going to say that the lines are blurrier necessarily. It's just that the lines are more drawn by yourself. And so we're held to personal accountability. That's probably the phrase that I heard the most as a beginning witch, especially when we were having ethical conversations, when we were talking about what it meant to be an ethical practitioner of magic and really just to be an ethical person, was that any decision you make, whether we're talking about a magical interaction that we're having, a spell or a ritual or whatever it is that we're doing magically, or if we're just talking about work that we're doing in the mundane world, because really these things go hand in hand, whatever it is that you're doing is going to reverberate throughout the realms, throughout the worlds. So, and it's not necessarily about 3, right? It's not about the rule of 3. As much as I love the numerology and the magical importance of 3. And I'm even wearing my triskel today, so you can see, you know, how potent I find that particular magical number. It doesn't come back in 3s necessarily, and it doesn't, magic doesn't care about your intent either. It really doesn't. It doesn't matter if you go into it with a pure heart. So in some ways, this idea of perfect love and perfect trust, which is a big concept within many, many orders of the craft, when it comes to magic and ethics, you can do something in perfect love and perfect trust, and that's not going to spare you the consequences from it. So it's a lot more about your actions and about what you've done than about what you meant to do. You're going to pay the price for magic, even if what you're doing is for the good of all. There is probably still a price for it. And I talk in another video that's already out there about how you can do divination to determine the cost or the price of magic that you want to do. It involves using a stone bowl, and there are other ways that you can do it, but within my tradition we find this to be an elegant solution for how to determine that cost or that sacrifice. Because that's essentially it when we're talking about magic, but really even other aspects of our life. There is an ebb and flow to all energy in the world. We know this from physics. We know this from quantum physics. But what we know from quantum physics is that it doesn't always work the way we think it's going to work, right? So we haven't quite figured out exactly the exact mechanics of how that energy works. So we put something out and the price may be greater than the job. Or we ask for a job to be done and the price may be significantly smaller than we would think. You know, maybe we're asking for this huge thing and the cost for that is actually really low. So that ebb and flow, that sacrifice for the magic can vary quite significantly. Regardless of what the sacrifice is or the cost is, there's also a cost sort of internally or to your psyche. I would argue on all 3 levels of your person, to all 3 soul parts, depending on what it is that you're doing. If you're acting in a way that is not in accordance with your personal ethics, and only you get to decide what those are. If I'm your teacher, I can't tell you what you think is right and wrong. My teacher didn't get to decide for me what I felt was right and wrong. And that's where I personally feel that things like the Wiccan Ardanes are not a good fit for me. When I look at those Ardanes, there are things that I look at and say, it says here that I shouldn't be profiting at all, that I shouldn't be making any kind of money from my witchcraft. I find that out of alignment with my ethics. Why shouldn't I have an exchange of energy? Money is a form of energy. If I am doing work for somebody, I should get paid for my work, even if that's magical work. So I find that document, and that's just one example, but I find that document to be wildly out of line with my ethics in many places. And there are other things that I find to be in line with my ethics. But if I accept it as a whole document and say I'm going to live my life by these ethics, then I'm going to be breaking them all the time. So instead, what I find useful for me and for my students is to sit down and think about, what is it that I can actually live with if I have to harm somebody, you know, the Wiccan Rede starts with, and it harm none. Okay. Well, the first question that always gets asked, and I've seen so many flame wars about this and different, like way back in the days of the BBS boards and then Yahoo groups, and, you know, I've seen witches just fight to the point where, you know, moderators were kicking them out of groups. So the question that always gets asked is, what if you're being attacked? What if it's now self-defense? Well, there seems to be exceptions for self-defense. Well, what if you are anticipating an attack? What if this? What if that? What if? For most traditional witches, what we do is, instead of starting with a baseline and saying there are all these exceptions to this baseline, is we start with something that's more inclusive for ourselves. And we say, there are circumstances under which I may harm somebody, but I recognize that I am going to pay a price if that happens, because I believe in the concept of personal accountability. And it goes beyond that, right? So I'm not here to say that traditional witches do or don't perform both blessing and blasting magic, that they do or don't perform both healing and harming magic. I don't know what a person does necessarily, because I am not the boss of that other witch and they are not the boss of me. We are very sort of independently acting people. And that's one of the great challenges. One of the things that makes us perhaps not as easily presentable to the public always, because we don't get to come across to the media and say, yeah, no, we don't hurt anybody, because it's in our ethics that we're just never going to hurt, and it harm none, do what you will. It's not our ethic to say that. It's in our ethic to say, yeah, I might cut someone if they have it coming. It's not in our ethic to say, oh no, I don't take money for my magic. It might be in your particular ethic to say that, but for a lot of us, it's in our ethic to say, yeah, I take money for doing readings. Yeah, I take money for doing magic for you. I'm not doing it for free out here. Yeah, I take money for teaching. My time is valuable. Time is energy. Money is energy. Let's make that exchange. That and the fact that our God looks so much like their devil, and that we sometimes call him by that name, also makes us a little less publicly acceptable to folks. So, you know, anyway, side thoughts. It's harder. It's a harder path in this sense, to have to sit down and genuinely really sort of create a governing set of rules for yourself. Because the truth is, if you violate your own ethics, you feel it at a much deeper level than if you're breaking somebody else's rules. A lot of times, if you break somebody else's rules, it's a situation of like, oh yeah, I guess I did it. I'll pay the penalty now. What's my fine? Ho hum. But if you break your own rules, you're usually feeling that on a really deep level. It affects you mentally in the fact that, you know, you have a hard time you have cognitive dissonance over the idea that you did this thing that you know is wrong. You believe it to be wrong. So you have a hard time resolving what you did with what you believe. It impacts how you feel in the sense that you're often walking around with this guilt and this shame, again, because it is just in conflict with who and what you are and how you see yourself. It can definitely impact how you interact with other people, often until you resolve the situation in some way, whether that's making amends or setting it right somehow, or forgiving yourself for having done whatever it was. Or maybe it's coming to terms with the fact that the action that you took was indeed within your system of ethics, that it was something that you find ethical now, but perhaps before you didn't find it ethical. So, because this can be something that changes over time, especially with new experiences. But those ethics don't change easily, and it's usually under pretty extreme circumstances. So coming to that resolution within yourself is, usually a pretty traumatic experience. So you may have to work through that in order to find healing for what you've been through. Both the thing that you went through and then also how you feel about the choice that you made and the action that you took. So it's interesting because those things that I was just talking about that are sort of the intangible effects of how one experiences the aftermath of acting out of accord with one's ethics are, I believe, part of the price that we pay when we break our ethical code. That's part of the price of having stepped out of alignment with our ethics. But it's only part of the price. So I've talked about the physical, or I've talked about the mental, and I've talked about the emotional. The physical, real world price is often, maybe you've got to pay a fine to somebody because you actually broke some kind of law or code or ordinance or, something along those lines. Maybe you've got to have, a face-to-face with somebody, or you've got to make things right, or you've got to repair the damage, or you've got to, whether that damage was an interpersonal damage or otherwise. But there's usually something in the real world that you've actually got to do, some kind of price. Maybe it's going to be that you're going to just have to live with the loss of whatever it was that you destroyed. Because often, whether it's metaphorical or physical, when we're talking about a violation of our ethics, it can kind of boil down to that. We blasted something all to high holy hell, and it doesn't exist, whether it's a relationship or the neighbor's cat. Examples are hard, but we've got to live with that and pay the actual real world price as well. And that can have rolling implications, and sometimes a lot bigger implications than we thought. I think you can see that this topic of ethics is multifaceted. It's definitely not just a topic that's reserved sort of for the religious sphere. In fact, in this particular case, I've not really brought religion into it, opinions of the gods or goddesses, thoughts from spirits or that type of thing. And for a lot of people in their traditions, those spirits, those deities have some kind of say or have an influence on the way ethics work. But I'm going to leave that to you and your tradition. Right now, I'm mostly just talking about the metaphysical implications of that cause and effect, that price that gets paid, because I think that that's something that does come into play, that it's just, it's the physics, it's the metaphysics of the work that we do, both in the physical world and in the spiritual world, or the energetic world, or all of the worlds. Knowing that there is more than one way to pick your ethical path through the world, I think is very helpful. And I hope that you have found this talk helpful. So share your thoughts. Don't let it be a flame war in the comments. Again, there's more than one right way to do this. I've just presented a couple, but I'd love to hear some of what you know and what you do and how you guide your life. Like, comment, share, do all the things. Check out the links. I've got some interesting books for you down there.